Yeah, 'cause Getty, it was amazing, just the bad timing, the bad luck. And in politics, more than half the battle is luck. He became premier just as the price of oil went over a cliff. So he became premier in 85. He actually won the leadership. 86 was an election, but the price of oil went down to $8 a barrel. And he was running deficits of $4 billion compared to a $12 billion budget. So so the deficit back then was equal to a third of the overall budget. And he was premier through some really tough times. And then, of course, when he retired in 92, Klein became premier, and the price of oil began recovering. So it was amazing just the bad timing he had. He was, as I said, like I did cover him for those years, radio and then television. It got pretty tense, let's say, the relationship between the media and Getty's office and Getty the person, because it was just bad news after bad news after bad news. Nothing was good. And of course, Getty lost his seat in the '89 election, and that made things even more toxic in terms of the relationship. And there's a lot of parallels you can see between what happened then and what's happening now with the price of oil. It does dictate how people perceive a premier. Premiers can make mistakes if times are good, but mistakes they make when times are bad are just magnified. And the thing is, though, about Getty was that he was always a gentleman. He really was. Like, he didn't lash out at the media. I know he likely wanted to. He never did. And so even though he went through a lot of tough times, his personal response was to try and keep a lid on anger and keep a lid on actually government spending. He didn't want to slash and burn. He tried to cut spending, but didn't do it fast enough. The thing about Don Getty is that even though he and I had a pretty rocky relationship when I was a reporter and he was premier, he began calling me in the last number of years just to talk about politics, talk about what it was like back then, and the sympathy he had for premiers these days through tough times. But anyway, he was a gentleman, I can call it that, in the best sense of the words, while premier. Just that he happened to have the bad luck of being premier in a really tough time. A lot of parallels to what happened with him to what's happening now.
Right. So as you mentioned, there was this Supreme Court decision last year, and it essentially, it applies to workers who provide quote unquote essential services. So, right, police, fire, ambulance, nurses, and so on. Teachers, yeah. Well, it can be teachers, yeah. Certainly in Alberta, it's been applied to teachers. Whether they provide essential services is questionable, but what the ruling essentially said is it is unfair for those kinds of workers to face a blanket ban on any kind of strike action, right? It's unfair because it doesn't set a level playing field for contract negotiations and collective bargaining. And in Alberta, of course, this has been very relevant because public sector workers here, government sector workers, have been, as long as I can remember, been faced with a blanket ban. They cannot strike.
I think that was a law brought in by the Lougheed government in the 70s.
Yeah, it's been around forever. So with the Supreme Court basically saying that law is illegal in Alberta, the government now has to come up with new legislation to kind of set the playing field and what labor action is actually allowed, which professions are essential and what might not be, and how that whole system is going to work about collective bargaining. So that's what I think we're going to see in the legislation. And it's going to be an interesting balancing act